Hello and welcome back to another episode of Telaah, and in the midst of the AI and tariff war, today we'll be reviewing Keyu book, The New China Playbook. In this book, Keyu uncovers Beijing's blueprint for global dominance beyond manufacturing for Malaysia as a hub. This is not just about theory, it's about playbooks so that we'll be able to thrive in the new changing world. And joining me in the studio, particularly to discuss this book, is Brian Wong, Assistant Professor in Hong Kong University, a Rhodes Scholar, a geopolitical analyst. He writes for the likes of Time, Fortune, Financial Times, and many others. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you very much for having me, Said. Thank you.
Yeah. So the copy that I have in my hand here is a copy signed by Keyu. So how do you find the book? Especially, how is it a special read?
I think it is an exceptional read, simply because it is so concise and yet emphatically clear in articulating key messages and debunking misconceptions about China.
Okay.
And I'm sure we'll go into more detail about it shortly, but there are two particular highlights that I see as standout features. And the first is the balance of the authorial tone, because we live in a world where increasingly discourse about China is very polarized, right? You either have folks who are unequivocal China skeptics, China bears who say, the coming collapse of China is imminent, China's over, China's finished. Or you've got folks who say, China's perfect, China's Superman, China's amazing, its path to a global success or dominance, which, mind you, the current leadership does not actually want. I don't think leadership wants dominance. It's inexorable, so you can't stop it. Both of these camps have their cheerleaders, and I think what Keyu does here is she says, look, the unequivocal bulls are too naive and simplistic about the challenges that China has, but all those bears and folks prophesizing the doom and death of China's economy and its growth trajectory, they also fail to understand the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that undergirds the Chinese people per se. And that ties me on to the second point as to why I found this read so appealing, and that is the humanistic nature of the way Keyu approaches a subject, right? You think about China these days, and the term automatically conjures images of these sprawling skyscrapers, these gigantically wide highways and fantastically built roads and trains. But China is a country of 1.4 billion people with over 50 ethnicities within its boundaries. And you've got folks who might have graduated from Harvard, very much like Keyu, they're Chinese, and then you've got folks who'd never stepped foot outside their own local township, and they're Chinese. So China's so diverse and immensely, and interesting. And I think what Keyu does here is she presents the human side of China and tells the stories of the Chinese as opposed to merely sort of officially sanctioned and endorsed, stories about the Chinese economy or the Chinese state per se.
Let's talk more about the misconceptions. You mentioned about the Western misconceptions towards China itself. So how was that discussed in this particular book?
Yeah, good. So I think Keyu and we both agree that it would be erroneous to say that everyone in the West misunderstands China. That is a wrong view per se. That is a wrong conception. But there are three particular conceptions I think she debunks quite effectively. And the first is the assertion that China is a communist country that has no private market freedoms. She challenges that by pointing to the fact that in 1978, then the ultimate leader and paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, said in the third plenum of the 11th Party Congress that China is going to embark upon the road to reform and opening up. And it would incorporate all sorts of capitalist institutions, markets, privatization of SOEs, reforms of both the rules governing trade and also rules governing domestic economic planning to devolve far more power to the markets and also local and provincial governments. And that is also why, in another recently conducted podcast, another China watcher would say that China is the biggest VC investor on this planet's history, because the way the local governments function is they have to, in many ways, invest into projects that would garner them revenue, that would generate revenue, that contribute towards their balance sheets. And up until rather recently, these projects were incredibly wide-ranging and often were not regulated, right? They were very much laissez-faire in a way, these investments took place, whether it be into the property markets, real estate, advanced manufacturing, or indeed, more generally speaking, any and all potentially employment-creating activities there. And second misconception that Keyu debunks is the view that China is a monolith, right? You hear these generalizations and assertions, whether it be folks saying China is an amazing country, it is a civilizational state, everyone thinks in 5,000-year terms, that's one end of the spectrum. Or the other end of the spectrum, you've got folks who say, oh, the Chinese, they're all brainwashed, they have no agency, they have no free will. But these are lies. And what Keyu does is she says, these are obviously lies, but I'm not going to aggressively attack you for it. Right. She's just going to display ways in which that is frankly untrue. And she does that by pointing to the fact that, of course, you've got gigantic metropolitan areas and megapolises like Shanghai and Beijing and Shenzhen. And mind you, Shenzhen rose from nothing 50 years ago to where it is now today. Its GDP increased by over 12,000 times over 40 years, right, in nominal terms. That there is a lot of variety and heterogeneity there, but at the same time, if you were to speak with different generations of the Chinese, and this is where I find her humanistic element coming through, she would describe how her generation of folks would have very different values from their parents, from their grandparents, right? That, whereas in the past, China had largely been, a more communitarian, a more community-centered country, at least as an economic form or political economy in the 1960s and 50s, Then in the 1970s and 80s, it became a very cutthroat sort of, every man for himself kind of environment, right? Because of the market liberalization. And yet now that we're dealing with, the Gen Zs and of course later, the second half of the millennials, to which I belong, for instance, these are folks who are far more individualistic, who don't want to have, as many children as the parents did, or the parents were unable to because of the one-child policy. They don't want to have any children at all, right, in these urban areas. So there is clear divergence, and I'm already generalizing here as we speak, right? These are generalizations, but at the very least they speak to the fact that China is not a monolith, and that ties me on to the final point I want to make that Keyu challenges, the final misconception, and that is the presumption that fundamentally everything in China is dictated by the top. Now that's an assertion, right? That you hear, they say, this guy is calling the shots. He's now in total control. The entire economy is driven by the will of one person only. But that is, again, a complete myth. Because if you look at the actual empirics on the ground, what she points to in a book is the important role played by the mayor. And I've challenged her on this. I've actually said it's not the mayor, it's the party secretary economy, because mayors are a bit more, like the second fiddle. They are the number two in the government. But in practice, who gets to call the shots? It's the party secretaries, right? It's the people who are endowed with the highest authority within the particular locality, whether it be on a township level or in a sort of county level and then city level and then finally provincial level. The party sec sets the tone, sets the picture and the broad directions, and then the mayor or the executive number one or the overall number two would then say, okay, my job is to find the policies that make this work. So in practice, whether it be her story or my story, we have one commonality, and that is power in China is not that heavily centralized. Sure, the government controls many facets of the lives of the civilians, but the control there is always constrained by both the challenges of granularity, in that they can't get into the weeds and the sort of, the incredibly fine-grained aspects of the lives of the people, because it's logistically impossible to monitor, nor is it particularly effective to determine each and every move made by individual citizens, right? On the contrary to assertions about total surveillance. But secondly, too, that there's a lot more bottom-up agency on the part of the leaders of these respective levels of government to set targets, to set goals, to say, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to match the target set by the very top. So in short, I think she debunks each of these narratives, right, of homogeneity, of top-down control, and of China being a communist, wholly state-owned economy incredibly well in the book.
Let's still deal with this issue of misconception, trying to debunk further the myth, because the idea in the Western world is that it's not the democracy, it should not be well developed, but instead, Keyu did mention about the balance between innovation and also political control.
Sure.
How did she describe that from her point of view?
So one quick clarification, right, and that's to say that I think both Keyu and I would also agree that the Chinese system as it exists is not perfect. Accountability is a serious question with which generations of party leaders have grappled, right? Mao Zedong's solution was to unleash the people upon the officials, right, through these violent, often deeply diabolical and destructive mass movements. Deng Xiaoping's solution was to turn China into a corporation. Jiang Zemin's approach was to co-opt many of the potentially sort of opposing elements, right, into the system, which was again a line that was continued by Hu Jintao and also Wen Jiabao, who placed considerably more emphasis upon social management, and that is a term that's been coined by sociologist Tom Pirker to describe essentially the unique idiosyncrasies of China in the early days of the 21st century. And now under Xi Jinping, of course, China is taking on a more, you might say, a heavy-handed approach on issues of security, on political stability and ideological purity. Okay. And both Keyu and I have observed that you cannot have these generalizations across different leaderships and say this is how the Chinese state handles innovation or handles growth per se, right? But it varies, and some might say it's a pendulum, others might say it's a dynamic evolution, so to speak. So that's just a preface for what I'm about to say. And what I would say here is the book is quite clear in noting the following. One, it is not a dichotomous trade-off. Very often, the most innovative, the most entrepreneurial individuals could well be people in the system. Deng Xiaoping, for instance, when he declared that it doesn't matter if you're black mouse, white mouse, if you can catch white cat, black cat, sorry, if you can catch mice, you're a good cat, okay? That is essentially Deng Xiaoping's top-down pragmatism, which was reflected to some extent by Zhu Rongji, the premier, right, who rose to power and complemented Jiang Zemin when he was the party's general secretary. Zhu Rongji again took a pretty sort of state-driven approach to the recapitalization of banks through a mixture of, putting them onto the stock markets through listing them, as well as, of course, cracking down on excesses and curbing bureaucratic inefficiencies within SOEs. These took, pretty darn substantive concentration of powers at the top in order to drive through, right? Economic decentralization was therefore built upon political centralization. You needed to have that amount of political will and resolve in order to see through these seismic transformations to the Chinese economy. So the first comment I'd note is the book made it pretty clear it's not a dichotomy. But secondly, too, of course, if we look at innovation in a bit more detail, we've got to divide it up into two different stages. The first stage is what startup world VC funders would say it's a 0 to 1 sort of story about, the basic research, the original research and original innovation, and the sort of coming up with, right, the gestation of new prototypes, groundbreaking research. And then on the other hand, you've got the 1 to 10, and that's what they would call the diffusion or the adaptation / adoption phase of the technology, right? Adapting it to individual circumstances and then adopting it and applying the technologies across a wide range of arenas and also contexts, so to speak. And what Keyu noted is that on a front of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, that kind of innovation, China today does very well. You look at the likes of Alibaba, Tencent, Pinduoduo, these giants that I can rattle off, and I'm sure we can all rattle off, literally off the tip of our fingers now. Why are they household names? It's because of the incredibly vicious competition that goes on in the Chinese economy, right? The fundamental difference between China today and the USSR of 30 years ago is that competition in the Chinese market is darn cutthroat. You don't get by just being nepotistically blessed, or being a crony appointee of the government. That's maybe in some cases that's a necessary entry ticket, even though that's increasingly not the case anymore, considering the shrinkage of the state-owned enterprise sector and the rise of the private sector. But more generally speaking, by far and large, it's competition along dimensions of reducing one's prices, improving one's quality, improving one's branding, acquiring foreign brands and technologies in order to make oneself more efficient. These are all necessary stages that Chinese companies have to undergo in order to get moderately successful in any particular sector of innovation. So on the front of 1 to 1,000, whether it be because of scale or the incredibly intense competition, I'd say the Chinese can innovate just as well, if not better than, their American counterparts, right? And you can see that with DeepSeek, where at a fraction of the amount of money poured into AI development that OpenAI has invested into, their model developments, DeepSeek's managed to accomplish roughly the same as what OpenAI has done. Now, of course, there's debates over distillation and over whether or not the costs are actually that low, but that's an aside, right? The broader message that I think Keyu emphatically predicted in her book, which came out before DeepSeek, is that on 1 to 1,000 innovation, China's got it in the bag. But of course, on 0 to 1, and again, this is where I see the power of nuancing in the book. she flags that she's concerned that if you have an environment where there are restrictions on speech, restrictions on ideological diversity, and restrictions on adventurism, and these restrictions are not just state-imposed, they're often societally imposed because of the culture, right, or the cultures that constitute China today, where, you know, in general, if you are someone who's starting out a business, you'd be pretty risk averse. You want to find the quickest path to delivering, or else, you know, your backers, whether they be state backers, state affiliated backers, or private backers, might just pull funding. Well, you don't want to commit to blue sky research that has a 0.1% chance of success. You want to commit to something that has 30 to 40% chance of success, namely adoption and diffusion, as opposed to the kind of basic research in which China still lags behind America today. And in fact, I think China lags behind South Korea, Japan, so on and so forth, in terms of the proportion of the GDP spent towards and allocated towards basic research. So that is a more nuanced answer to your question. There's no simple answer or formula. We've got to be a bit more specific than that.
Up until now, we've been discussing and working from the framework of a system framework, discussing about the book. Let's move on to culture.
Great.
Because Keyu did not designate any particular chapter from the cultural perspective, but every now and then the issue of culture, you know, because I think the misconception also props up from elements of culture. So how did Keyu expresses the cultural Chinese culture that affects their entrepreneurial vigor?
Very good question. Look, before I talk about what Keyu says, I'll just ask you or the audience the following question. Would you say that folks living in Selangor have the same culture as those in Perlis or in Sarawak? Maybe not, right? Would you say that folks living in, say, Kampong Baru share the same culture as folks living in Monkiara?
You're sure that you're very familiar with all the places in Malaysia.
Right, no, but I think it's also important to note that if we can't generalize about the culture of Malaysia like that, then how could we generalize about a country that's over 50 times in population of Malaysians? And that's the point that Keyu really wants to articulate. There's no singular Chinese culture, right? Now you might say, oh, they're Confucian values and ideals that matter. Some of them are Buddhist, some of them are Taoist. Okay, the Chinese are very hardworking, but these are all just crass generalizations that are anecdotal, that we often hear made by pundits, right, who observe China. And I think what Keyu rightly notes in the book is, yes, there's some grain of truth to that, and I'll talk about a specific application of that shortly, but yes, there's some grain of truth to that, but you really can't just slap this label onto all the Chinese and say this is how all Chinese peoples behave, because someone coming from, say, Tibet and Xinjiang, no less Chinese. They're Chinese, right? Chinese citizens, part of the Chinese political community, part of the common space. They would likely have very different religious values and also social customs and rituals from someone who grew up in Guangzhou, right? And I, having traveled to all corners of China personally myself, I can attest to that, you know? The food, the customs, the views on marriage, the views on reproduction and having children, or the importance of education, they vary from place to place, province to province. But with that said, there are two common tenets that I think Keyu's identified, which are useful in informing our more nuanced deconstruction and analysis of China per se. The first is the broadly universal emphasis placed upon education. And there, she actually identifies the roots of this custom, or this sort of ritualistic, you know, family of thoughts in the Keju system, which is the examination-based meritocratic system by which officials would be appointed and promoted in imperial China, right? So how were folks picked and chosen to serve as officials in China? Not based on their looks, not based on, you know, so-and-so's family, so-and-so's cousin, but instead you had to undergo and write and sit these blind examinations, like triple blind, right? Or at least double blind, by contemporary standards, and you'd have to jump through all these hoops. First, you know, it's a relatively sort of your region, and then it's your equivalent of a province, right? And then finally go to Beijing for the exams, and how you perform and fare in these exams would determine if you get admitted into the civil servants and the civil bureaucracy, and also where you placed within the bureaucracy per se. And that emphasis upon examinations is also discussed by Huang Yasheng, right, when he talks about, of course, East. You know, examinations come first, right, as a core part of his East as the key recipe for China's success and also for the setbacks that are holding it back. So Keyu points to this sort of valorization of education as an important good, as a key driving force behind, of course, modern China's economic growth and trajectory at large. And also there's a second element concerning culture, where it's implicit in the claims that she discusses, but I do think it holds a lot of salience, and that is China's culture is ultimately in many ways shaped by the forces with which it is intertwined and the peoples with which the Chinese interact, okay? So in her case, she speaks of the fact in a book that she was, brought up in a Chinese household, but spent her formative years in education terms, right, in the States. And that opened up her mind and thoughts to both Western values and also the shortcomings and strengths of the West as a bloc. And it is indeed through direct immersion, direct interaction, that many in the upper middle class and the middle class of China over the past 30 years have come to accrue cultural ideals and norms that are probably quite alien and foreign to their parents, so to speak. And one of these examples would be the LGBTQIA sort of culture that China does have, right? People say, there's no queer life in China. Well, wait till you go to Chongqing, and beyond just, you must go to Chongqing. And not just because of course, the cultural or the subcultural undercurrents, but also because of the amazing architecture and landscape of Chongqing per se. And I think these facets speak to the role played by cultural and education exchanges in gradually transforming the cultural norms and values of China in an organic way, right? Not in a way that denatures China, but improves its diversity and plurality. And that also ties me on to the point I really want to make about why, if you look at a lot of these restrictive measures adopted by the US these days on students of Chinese origin, it is self-undermining, because this fundamentally is what undermines America's greatest sort of weapon of leverage, right? And that is its ability to bring the best, the creme de la creme into its own country, to provide them with new ideas and new cultural tropes and new experiences, and have them return to their country with a different and changed mindset. And what's happening today is that as these doors shut, the space for organic dialogue and mutual empathy and understanding is also shrinking as well, at least when it comes to America vis-a-vis Chinese students. But ironically, but unsurprisingly, China is opening up its borders to visitors from all over the world. It's granting visa-free access to folks from over 100 countries, and that's because, and I think it's a right step in definitely the right direction, the Chinese leadership firmly believes that China today is is at the stage where it can proudly say, look, we've got our own culture, we've got our own way of life, our own approach to governance. You may not like it very much. Why don't you come and experience it before making up your mind, though, concerning whether or not it is actually a good thing or a bad thing? And that, to me, is precisely a sign of China's maturing. It is not yet mature, but it is a maturing power. And as Keyu says, China is an adolescent country, right? Very much like a teenager, a very powerful, a very influential, a very high potential teenager, like a teenage superhero, but it is still in its adolescent years. You've got to recognize that China... 5,000 years. Yeah, sure, despite the 5,000 years that are attributed to the civilization, but remember, modern China is not just and is not reducible to civilization, right? It's only been around on planet Earth, ever since 1949, and you can do the quick maths here, a little over 75 years, okay? Over 75 years, per se. Yes, I've got the maths right. And that is exactly why, both Keyu and many other reasonable observers of China would say China's got a lot of room to grow. China's got a lot of room to develop economically, and it's certainly got the potential and the resolve to do so, whether it be as a country, as a government, or as a ruling party in the case of the Communist Party of China.
Brian, there's one particular point that you raised which I feel like we need to go slightly deeper.
For sure.
Because all we understand about China is very centralized, but at the same time you also mentioned about merit. So this is not easily noticeable when you're talking about very centralized system. Perhaps maybe we should illustrate how is merit being emphasized and practiced in a very centralized system.
Let me just start with a case study. There was once a very bright, natural scientist, born and raised and brought up in China, and went through some of the top and most competitive Chinese institutions, right, elite institutions, in China before he went overseas and abroad to study and conduct his postgraduate studies, so on and so forth, and spent up to 10 years in London as a postdoc.
Okay.
Then, upon completing his postdoc stint, he was approached and recruited back into Tsinghua, the premier education institution of China, to serve as a professor, or basically rise through the professorial ranks before he was given eventually the number 2 job in Tsinghua, the presidency of Tsinghua. Now, this gentleman was then basically said to be, not just someone who was academically gifted. He was also seen as civically minded. And so from his number 2 seat in Tsinghua, he was moved to helming a freshly established ministry in charge of natural resources and basically looking after the environment as well, by extension. It's an environmental protection ministry. And he was appointed the minister of that ministry, Then subsequent to that stint, he then went on to, of course, serving in Beijing as the mayor of Beijing and is now the Shanghai Party secretary. This gentleman speaks fluent English, is well respected, highly regarded in his own academic field, is incredibly competent in navigating and dealing with international commerce and businessmen, and he's certainly aware, of all the tectonics and dynamics at hand unfolding between China and America, the UK and the EU. He's been in the UK, literally for almost a decade, right? This gentleman, with the name of Chen Jining, is amongst the 24 most powerful men in China today, sitting in the Politburo. So this example, what does it tell us? I think it highlights several key propositions about the way personnel movements and deployments work in China. And I'm going to end with a preface or a caveat after that. The first is to note that there's an emphasis upon a wide range of, backgrounds and exposure, that there's a clear emphasis upon rotation per the bureaucracy. They don't want someone who's just been an academic for the entirety of their lives suddenly end up in a very senior leadership position. They've got to head up a ministry first, right? They've got to, be posted to 2 of China's most important cities, right? One's the capital and the other is the economic powerhouse of China, the heartlands of China's economy. He's got to be tested first. And if he fails at any of these, or had failed at any of these key stages, he'd be booted, he'd be out, right? And this is very important. But secondly, an emphasis upon technical expertise. If you look at the composition of the Politburo, out of the 24 men who have been appointed, a vast majority of them are either trained in the political sciences, in law, or in natural sciences, and of course mechanical and aerospace engineering. These are the backgrounds of up to 80%, of the men. Yes, unfortunately, it's all men, but fortunately, they are experts and they know what they're doing in the Politburo today. And if you expand that to the Central Committee of over 210 individuals, right? These are, again, the 210 most powerful individuals in the Communist Party. A vast majority of them have STEM backgrounds and STEM, training, especially when it comes to environmental sciences and geology, aerospace engineering and mechanical engineering, and of course, to some extent as well, earth sciences, or rather urban planning and urban construction, and civil engineering. So in short, the second key tenet here is that officials are promoted also in accordance with their own professional backgrounds and knowledge expertise. And finally, and this is crucial, how exactly are personal decisions actually made in such a gigantic country? There's a system called Tiao Kuai, which Keyu talks about in the concluding chapter and remarks. I'm going to expand upon it, a tad more here for the audience's benefits. What is Tiao Kuai? Tiao stands for the vertical, and Kuai stands for the horizontal, like a region, so to speak, right? So the equivalent would be, in the case of Malaysia, right, the vertical would be the education, or the officials in charge of education on a federal level, in charge of education, on a state level, in charge of education, on a city, and of course, in a district and constituency level. And yet, on the other hand, you've got the horizontal side of the picture, where of course, the equivalent here would be, again, the state, the city, and the district within the city, so to speak. The Tiao Kuai system is one in which officials are both rotated across different verticals and different horizontals, and also, to a very large extent, they're vetted by the superiors across both fronts, right? So take a case in point of someone who's in charge of, what we call the National Development and Reform Commission, right? This is called Fagaiwei. And say we're talking about someone who was previously the NDRC, the lead or the director in charge of the NDRC of one province, say Zhejiang province. Now, chances are this individual may or may not also serve concurrently as a vice governor of the province as well as amongst the standing committee. But at the very least, right, if they're a member or if they're in charge of the NDRC, then they would have to both communicate and work with the number 2, okay, of the provincial government, namely the governor of that province, as well as reporting, in an implicit manner to the national DRC, the NDRC top man in Beijing. And their performance would be vetted not just by these 2 leads and two superiors and bosses, they would also be vetted and assessed by the team members, okay, whether it be fellow, DRC leads from other provinces or assessed by, of course, fellow members of, again, the provincial government in which they work. So there is peer review, there is performance-based feedback, and of course, the feedback from the people also matters. And this is where Keyu, spends a pretty substantive amount of time talking about the availability of digital and electronic governance forums, of online and offline reporting channels. There's even an institution called Xinfangju, that individuals can go to. They're really unhappy with officials and go through the Xinfangju and say, I want to raise a petition to formally register my complaint against these officials, right? These are all mechanisms and channels by which the government and the bureaucracy gathers feedback, and decisions are broadly made, at least in the sort of middling tiers of the bureaucracy, in accordance with meritocratic considerations. But I want to end with a caveat here. I don't want to give off the impression that, the Chinese system is perfect. It's a meritocracy. Everyone who's good gets promoted. Everyone who's corrupt gets to boot. China today still, as Keyu rightly noted, has to grapple with serious issues of corruption, of bureaucratic ossification, of risk aversion, of folks who are too eager to please, and they look over their shoulders and they want to please the bosses, and they do all sorts of crazy things. For instance, spending 150 billion RMB in a very, very rural part of a rural province to build lots of bridges that no one uses. These are problems that exist in China today. And furthermore, let's face it, any and all political system has its non-meritocratic elements. And factionalism, to some extent, personal loyalty-based promotions, where individuals are chosen, whether it be on a basis of the loyalty or largely with reference to loyalty in mind. These moves, they exist. And some would say, doesn't this prove that the Chinese system is innately defective? But to that, I would say 2 things. One, it does show that the Chinese system has a lot of catching up to do in rooting out unnecessary and excessive cronyism. But 2, name me a political system, democratic or non-democratic, where personal relations like guanxi, the West like to say it's guanxi, but really it's just relationships and soft ties. Name me a system where weak ties don't matter or strong ties don't matter. I can't think of one. At least not one for a large enough country, right? In India, in Indonesia, relations still matter a lot. And I spend a lot of time talking with respectable leaders in countries like Indonesia, and also, in Cambodia, and they would say the same thing. Name me a country where personal relations don't matter. So that's what I would say in terms of the governing sort of structures and also the path to promotion and rise for Chinese bureaucrats, so to speak.
Brian, it seems like we need a sequel to this discussion. Maybe you should come back sometime. When will you be planning to come over to Kuala Lumpur?
Oh, well, I love Malaysian makan. Saya suka makan Malaysia.
So,
that'd be great.
This is not just a book review to me, this is a masterclass. Thank you for joining us, Telaah.
My absolute pleasure.
Episode. Jangan lupa untuk berikan cadangan anda juga. Kalau ada buku, I need to address my Malaysian audience.
Of course.
Because this is meant to get more people on board.
Absolutely.
Anda boleh cadangkan buku juga, selain daripada judul yang telah pun kami senaraikan di dalam telaah.my. Brian, once again, thank you very much. Please come back. Dan jangan lupa untuk terus bersama Telaah. Kita jumpa lagi. Hari ini kita bincang The New China Playbook.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.